everyone at this roundtable of the Version Festival. I'm Csaba Tóth. I'm an editor of a local online news portal, Mérce. And here are my guests. Sitting beside me here in Budapest is Olga Zubkovskaya, who is a translator, Budapest-based translator and an administrator of a Belarusian group in Budapest, so Belarusians living in Budapest. And joining us online is Almira Usmanova, who is teaching at the European Humanities University in Vilnius, Lithuania. And today we are here to discuss a 16-minute short film called Walls that was produced by Belsat about one of the most iconic occurrences that happened during the Belarusian protests, mass protests and uprising starting on August 9th after the warped presidential election in the country. I would like to start with a few sentences as introduction of where I'm coming into this story. We started very heavily covering the events of Belarus in Hungarian, both in live blogs and in news articles on our portal. We were almost the first one doing that, and it was one of the most so-called postmodern or most incredible experiences for me in this year, because as we saw the protests unfolding, on the third day we were almost, when we were kind of evaluating the events, we were almost sure, okay, this is now, interior ministry and state repression will really happen, and this is going to be a tragedy. And after the mass protests happened, the Sunday mass protests, the pendulum swinged back for us, watching it from here, from Hungary. Okay, this should surely lead to the resignation and the clear out of the Lukashenko regime, of the KGB. That many people cannot be ignored, and none of that happened. So, both of our expectations were wrong. So my first kind of introductory question of looking at that film, and that film is, as you will see, it is freely available at the webpage of Versio after registration, and can be watched from outside Hungary too. As you can see in the short film, it is in really mesmerizing detail the kind of the traditional image in Eastern Europe that we could see 40, 50 or 60 years ago quite often in uprisings in the socialist bloc, at least on photos. When people are gathering to seek out their relatives that have been detained by the special police, by the interior ministry forces. And that was one of the iconic events of the whole unfolding protest movement. And my first question would be, what really does it tell about what happened there? And looking at the detentions that were really fervent in the first weeks of August, what happened to those people after that? Because of course, from the international media covered their detention, the brutality on the streets. They even covered people gathering around prisons, but we don't know where this situation stands now. Do they still illegally detain people in that manner? How that changed? What do you know about this? And first, I would turn to Olga, and then to Amir.
Well, thank you for your question. I guess I'm here in a similar position like you are, because I'm not really much of a participant of those events. I'm an outside observer. I guess I'm probably a more active participant than you are, in a way that, the events of the August 9, 10, and everything that came after elections brought together many Belarusians living abroad to the unprecedented scale. So I haven't really seen that happening before. So when going back to your question, what happened to those people, as far as I can see, following Facebook, following social media, Telegram, etc., Some of them are still staying in the country and trying to seek justice. Unfortunately, they are failing because the police is refusing to start cases against the perpetrators of violence. Some of them fled the country and are now staying abroad in Poland, Lithuania, Czech Republic. And sometimes I'm even thinking that people who so the countries which provide really mass support to refugees from Belarus are not just the neighboring countries, as some people might be tempted to claim, but those are the countries which survived at some point a similar kind of uprisal, as you have already mentioned, in somewhere in the 50s and the 60s. And I think in this respect, if we come back to Hungary, Hungary is somewhat an unfortunate, or I would say appalling example, because Hungary doesn't really run any kind of state program to support refugees from Belarus. And Hungary is probably one of the countries of the European Union which did not openly say that the regime is illegitimate. Yeah, so I guess that's it that I wanted to say.
What happened with the detentions and the victims of detentions, human rights-wise, in Belarus since we have seen, since those footages were recorded? And I'll turn to Almira for the answer now.
Yes, thank you. I would like to probably to give also some statistics. It's always important to have in mind and just to imagine, to understand what is the scale of repression. For those who have been following the Belarus events before elections, it was already clear that the scale of detentions has been unprecedented. But before 9th of August, there were about 2,000 cases, 2,000 people who were detained on different occasions when they were queuing, when they were staying in chains or queuing or just walking to the streets. Then within 3 days, from 9th till 11th, more than 6,700 people were detained. And during these 3 months, up to today, up to this date, it's almost 11,000 people. So just imagine that it's actually the machine of repression, including the riot police and the courts, the militia. It's actually becomes even more aggressive, and there have been many more detained people during last 2 or 3 weeks. For instance, during last Sunday march, which means 3 days ago, the detentions were so brutal and so violent and so numerous that by Monday it became known that almost 1,400 have been detained. So actually that what was shown in the film in the very first few days after the election day, that was a shock for everyone, and for those who were participating in the events, for the parents and relatives of people who were detained. But unfortunately, it's really awful to say this, but 3 months later, it became almost a routine because people go on marches and on the not only on Sunday marches but also on Saturdays and on Mondays, and they never know whether they will be able to come back home. Yes, and when historians compare the scale of repressions with some historical precedents, the first two references, actually 3 references which come to mind, it's the history of Polish Solidarność movement, then it's certainly 1937, but also 1933. And historians say that in comparison to 1933, when in Nazi Germany many like tens of thousands of people were detained, the scale of repression in today in Belarus twice higher. So that tells a lot, actually. It's just to give you some idea how it's going on. And now regime, of course, tries to oppress any kind of opposition and people belonging to different social groups. It's actually very different from what was happening on 9th, 10th, and 11th of August, when it was a kind of random choice or random selection. Right now, when people have realized their kind of social and class and professional identities in the struggle, they form the chains of solidarity nearby the universities or the hospitals, etc. And so now, in each social and professional group, there have been very targeted repressions. It's not only detention, but also hiring people and other forms of persecution.
This repression, in one word, became more systematic, but lost nothing of its harshness. So it hasn't subsided just because it's not on the front page of international news media. But also an interesting question. Yes, Mr. Mawar?
Yeah, just one remark. It became actually harsher. It became really more awful than it was, for instance, a month ago.
More methodology than only just protest repression. So a question about this, like already as you mentioned, those people who go out to marches that are still in the tens of thousands in Minsk, but also in the thousand in Pinsk, Rodna, Brest, systematically, like almost every end of the week, and they march out on the streets not knowing if they can ever go back home. They might end up in prison. So who are, I will again start with Olga. Who are the people who are doing this regardless of months of struggle and not bring Rukin? How can we, from what you gather from the internet, from back in Belarus, and from what you know, who are the typical protesters who are still standing up against the Lukashenko regime?
Well, at some point I came across a research which was interviewing people who are participating in those protests, and you can pretty much say that it's those are the people from all layers of society. So you can't really find, like, let's say, a typical protest. You can't really claim that this would be intelligentsia or IT people or workers. So you basically can find people from all social layers and people of all ages, which is really important. Also, if you look at the, let's say, at the calendar of the protests or what's going on week by week, by now it's already some sort of tradition that on Mondays you have the pensioners march, when the people of older age are going to the street. On Tuesdays, I think there is the disabled people with disabilities march. On Saturdays, there would be women's march, and then on Sundays, there would be like a general march for everyone to join.
We could see it about the typical week's protest calendar that highlights sort of similar or kind of highlights issues within the movement. But the same question would go for you as well. I mean, who would be the social groups or the protesters who are still kind of perseverant, or is this the majority of the August protesters, or did it restructure in any way, in your opinion?
I agree with Olga that by now, probably it was not like that even 3 months ago, but by now the people of all social strata and all social layers are represented and are participating. And actually the harsher repressions become, the more people get involved into the protest, because the main aim, or the main, let's say, stake is that people are protesting not only because or against the electoral frauds, but against violence. And violence is always, it's still there, and the question of violence became really of crucial importance. About social groups, I think by now it's easier to say who are not participating in this protests and different forms of the resistance, because in certainly the inhabitants of the big cities, mostly of Minsk, they are much more active than the rest of the population. Also because in smaller cities and even in such cities as Gomel, Grodno, or Brest, the repressions were very high, and people are not really daring, or they have kind of more problems with getting to the streets. But in Minsk, marches and this calendar of marches, which was already mentioned, is more or less regular. Even if, just also imagine this, it became clearer after the Sunday march that took place 3 weeks ago, that people who might be detained and who get detained by now, they can be charged with criminal cases and not with administrative measures. So actually those who are going now to the marches, they get even higher risks than it was before. But people continue to go. What is important is that for Belarusian protests, one of the major slogans, which was born in August, or probably was used already before, is that the protest should continue every day in any form. So, for instance, doctors, they start forming the chains of solidarity half an hour before they start their work in the hospitals and clinicals, which means around 7 in the morning. But in the evening, what is happening, and this is an extremely important form of self-organization and of horizontal communication, it's the organization of various kinds of events, including lectures, musical concerts, tea drinking, and children's plays, etc., in the local districts and in the courtyards of residential houses. So this is a movement which became very, very important and very influential during over the course of this last 3 months. And the authorities, they are aggressively oppressing the marches, but actually they can do almost nothing against this mobilization of local communities in their districts. So if we're speaking about this district activities and the local chats, it's actually clear that here is the core, or the very important basis, let's say, for the mobilization of all people through these small local communities. This never happened before in the history of Belarus.
This is, I think it's very important that you mentioned the local communities and the local committees that are kind of running it. It just shows how the protests could come back every week, how embedded the resistance in the society is, which is kind of really unprecedented. When we, and I'm always getting back to that pattern of what do we see about this country, because that's a very traditional problem in the EU, in the West, as well as in Russia. I think that in the past, before this movement, there was very little we could see from the politics or inner workings of Belarus. Belarus was kind of this, it was always news about Lukashenko, his regime, this grotesque leader that is kind of a funny, it has a funny edge to it to people who are living very far away from that. Not for Hungarians, of course, but much farther. And you know, he's a dictator, and this is running this dictatorship like in all the days, and nothing ever changes. Whereas now we could see like the workers striking, actually spontaneous striking committees come up in the factories in August. A few weeks before, you know, the election committee leaders, so like the president that has the oppositionist president who has been kind of endorsed or accepted at this point by many European countries as the legitimate president in exile of Belarus, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, has called for a general strike in the country a few days back. So what my next question would be is like, what we are seeing from the protests is the opposition commission, the so-called opposition commission, and their political statements. Whereas at the same time, we could see that in the country there are these sort of semi-autonomous communities also organizing. What do you think, or again, gathering from the news coming out of trustworthy news coming out of Belarus and Eritrea, what do you think is the political connection between these two organizations? How important are the election or the opposition leaders, and how important are the local committees and local figures in this?
I think, and Elmira will correct me if I'm mistaken, I think that the very specificity of what's going on in the country is that there is the protest is very much about, it's not about the top-down thing. It's about building horizontal solidarity. And on my side, I can see it not only in terms of, local communities coming together and having tea parties and discussions, but also if you look at the Belarusian community living abroad, and there is about 1.5 million people living abroad, you could see that there are also local communities in different countries worldwide coming together first to organize exit polls at the embassies to see if the votes were counted fairly, then going on. And this is pretty much a very loose structure, so there is not a single coordination point in spite of what the Belarusian state media claims. So each group and each country tries to find what is possible and tries to build solidarity within the community. So even though there is some sort of communication between the Coordination Council in Lithuania, and there are attempts to establish connection with these local chats in the country, I would say that it's very localized, and it's about really building horizontal solidarity.
So you would think there is no apparent leader within the country of those movements?
I think,
or groups of people who are kind of...
I might be mistaken because I'm not really in the country.
Yeah.
But I would say that, at least for me personally, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is more like a symbol of the protest than a leader of the protest. And I also come on social media again and again, I come across the claims that this is a leaderless protest. And that's what makes it so resilient and so powerful.
Pretty much the same questions to Amira Usmanova as well. What do you think are the interplay of the political structure situation between these two players, the coordination commission and the local councils?
Well, I would like to continue this issue, this very peculiar situations that we have in Belarus, and that makes it so unusual and so incredible, actually, in comparison to any other protest in other countries, because indeed it's a leaderless protest, and that's something that really puzzled many experts and theorists and just journalists and anyone else who wouldn't believe that the protest may continue, and they will continue if there are no leaders. But here are two things which probably are important to understand, to talk about. First thing is that during 26 years of the governance of Lukashenko, he actually removed from the political scene many other of his opponents who were trying during different electoral campaigns, who were trying to participate in the elections. So Belarusians got used to this unfortunate situation, to this history of oppression of the political opponents of Lukashenko. And during election campaign of this summer, starting from the detention of Tikhanovsky and then of Babarika, and then the exile of Tsepkalo, it already became clear in July that leaders will follow the same fate. And people started to self-organize. They had been self-organizing not only in August and September. It's really important, and I was following this, the news and also the development of this election campaign. I was following starting from May, and I was amazed by the incredible mobilization of people who would participate in different actions, who would queue in lines in order to leave their votes or to their complaints. So actually, people started to self-organize, organize almost like half a year ago, and they continue. And second point, which makes this political situation and the Belarusian case so interesting, is that never before it was, I mean, the situation of leaderless protest partially became possible due to the advancement of new technologies. And it's for scholars of technologies and communications, it's very interesting moment when I mean, when we discuss, can the technology can the technology be designed to be genuinely democratic? And now what we see in the development of Belarusian protest movement, we see that Telegram actually became such a technology which was designed as genuinely democratic, because the mobilization of local communities is taking place through the local chats. The communication of the news coverage in a situation when almost all non-state media are banned and they cannot normally function, and everyone now is a journalist in this sense. So the authorities don't really know how to stop the flow of information, just because everyone is a journalist or is a filmmaker, let's say, for him or herself. And that's been done not only through the smartphones, but the transmission, the sending of all of these materials, that's done through Telegram. So this is the technology issue, and the technology has become really very handy, very important for the mobilization of from the how to say, from the ground.
Thank you very much. I think we've come to a very interesting point here, which is how, and I can identify with that because kind of it's only an innocent, were only more innocent protest movements in Hungary, during which our blog became a news portal. So like we started basically just blogging on the ground from events. Maybe this is why we were kind of we paid more solidarity. We were more solidar with we showed more solidarity for our colleagues in Belarus. That they were amazing blogs coming out of seemingly nowhere. Of course, they were existing before, but the job they have done was really professional. For instance, Next, our onliner, there was very little, and you kind of need this experience in covering the events for weeks. There was very little disinformation coming out of those unprofessional channels. So the channels were really well organized. What was your experience? How much effect these new Telegram or blog media channels played in actually organizing all the people in resistance, or organizing Belarusians abroad? How important they were, do you think?
I think pretty important. So if you look at, I think Telegram might be easily one of the most popular communication channels currently. When it comes to people living abroad, so the whole exit poll project, which was run, I think, in like 20 countries or even more.
Can you tell more about this? So what was the exit poll project actually?
When at the beginning of the electoral campaign, it became pretty clear that elections are going to be rigged. And in Belarus, there was a platform Voice that came into action, which allowed people to photograph their ballot and upload the photograph online. However, it was not really clear what to do with Belarusians living abroad. And then there was like a discussion, an online discussion, and during that discussion, they came up with the idea of the exit poll. And people were just, slowly inviting their friends. They living abroad in different countries. And by the time it started, it was a pretty much impressive company. And all of them used one Telegram channel. And that's how they coordinated their efforts. That's how they developed the form for collecting the responses of those who voted and for data exchange afterwards. And then, of course, when it became clear that even though elections are rigged, the transit of power is not going to happen, people stayed on those Telegram channels, but started thinking like, okay, what can we, people living abroad, do for the country? And now there are several of those Telegram channels where people discuss what and how they can do it. It's about justice, it's about students, it's about helping refugees. It's about, you name it. There are different topics, and if you're really interested and you're really active, you can find something that is interesting for you, and then people come together, discuss things, and try to come up with some kind of action plan to carry forward. So yes, for those who live abroad, internet and Telegram channels are pretty important.
Were these channels actually existing before, or do we know about any channels? And this is already a question to Amia Usmanova. But also partially, if you want to answer it, you're very welcome to answer it. Maybe in after. Were these channels actually existing in any real form before events started to kick in, before the election campaign, or were they mostly formed during the protest uprising or the election campaign?
Yes, thank you. It's a really important question, and it explains the discussion of how and why Telegram channels became so important for the Russians. It's crucial. It's really essential. Firstly, I would like to start with saying that me, my students, my colleagues, friends, many of us have been occasionally using Telegram channels before, but till certain moment when media outlets still worked more or less okay, and Viber or WhatsApp were more important as communicators, we did not realize this particular potential of Telegram channel. But when internet was blocked by the Belarusian authorities for 3 days, so from 9th, 10th, and 11th, the entire country lived without internet. And it is the same 3 days when the state unleashed the terror. And during those 3 days, the number of people who signed up for Nechta and for other Telegram channels just multiplied so significantly, because the technology of Telegram allowed to people to get connected through VPN, through VPN, and it did not depend on the internet in the country. Moreover, that the founder of Telegram also added small capacities for the Telegram channels, and so Lukashenko and the regime, they wanted actually to leave the country, the population, the Belarusians, without any alternative sources of information, but they've got into the trap, because within these 3 days, they actually brought all the people who are interested and who were searching for information to the Telegram channels. So that's how it happened. And the success of Telegram channels has very much to do with this particular situation of 3 days of life without internet. And also one more progress in which I would add here is that there are many Telegram channels, and Nechta, as you probably know, and if you have heard, the authorities have started a real war against Nechta and against the Stepan Putila and others, and a few weeks ago, they have recognized, I mean, they have declared that Nechta is an extremist channel. And so what it means for the ordinary Belarusians is if they go to the marches and if they get detained, if their smartphones will, and actually their smartphones will get into the hands of those of the riot police, that will be a reason for additional charges if the connection to, if the subscription to Nechta channel would be discovered on the smartphone of anyone. So you see that actually, and also for other media, it means that since Nechta was announced as an extremist channel, they cannot republish the images or the videos or the information from Nechta. But still, that actually didn't really change much the situation, because Nechta continues to to send information, and people, as a number of subscribers, I have looked for it, it didn't change significantly. But the authorities really have huge fear against Telegram channels. There are many now, and they started real hunting against the owners of the local Telegram channels, even in the districts. So they consider technology, Telegram in particular, as the main enemy of the regime.
Yeah, a little side note here. Telegram is important because it uses end-to-end encryption, so it basically it makes it very hard, or a little bit more challenging, so to say, for state authorities to catch the message between two people. And the European Commission and the EU just recently started plans to ban the end-to-end encryption within the EU, citing terrorism concerns and so on. So this is this would happen in, for example, in Belarus, and that would be already kind of illegal, but outlawing that. Kind of similar things happen here with end-to-end encryption messaging apps. But getting back to Nechta, I'm sorry about my warped pronunciation on the first line here. Getting back to Nechta, what do we know that could be publicly said about the people who are organizing it or doing it? What do we know about who are the people sharing things in Nechta and on the Telegram channels? Or what kind of people they are?
Well, just I was speaking about the owners of the channel, its founders, or about people who are sending the videos and messages and news.
From the Belarusian tech industry or civil society in any form, or we don't know anything about it.
No, actually, the history of Nechta is well known, and if you look to Stepan Potila he lives in Poland, and they have team. There were some problems in the team of Nechta probably 2 months ago or 1 month ago, and it was precisely because Nechta became much more ambitious than it used to be. Stepan Potila founded Nechta in probably 2 or 3 years ago. Until recently, it didn't really play such an important role. But then with all these events that happened after 9th of August, and with the enormous importance, the role that Nechta played in the self-organization of people during those events, the Western media started actually to take interviews and to publish and to make video interviews and to write about the phenomenon of Nechta. And if you're interested, there was a really great article in The Wired I think it was in the end of August. So the phenomenon of Nechta has been already analyzed from several points of view. And when Stepan Potila is asked about whether he is the organizer of the protest, of course he refuses, because it would be not correct to call Nechta the organizer or the leader of the protest, and And even when this magazine, The Wired, when they were writing about the orchestration of the protest, that might be more correct formulation, but still Telegram is the technology, and Nektar became the channel that really united people around a very particular agenda, let's say.
Thanks for that. Getting back to organizing or some other methods of organizing. Olga was, if I know it well, one of the organizers of, for example, the Budapest Solidarity protests with Belarus, or she was part of that community. How the idea came, and why did you get involved in this kind of so we had like 2 protests at the embassy of Belarus on, I think, 2 Sundays or Saturdays, if I remember it well. And I would just like for her to tell more about how this has been organized, how Belarusians in Hungary got together for this.
Well, I think that I will start a little bit afar. I think what is very interesting, interesting is probably not a correct word, about this year's election campaign and the elections and everything that happened after, is the gap between the authorities and the society. And the authorities consequently make a number of steps that lead to the radicalization of people. And in our case, in case of Belarusians living abroad, those were the events around elections, because first the embassy was allowed to nominate people from the community into the electoral commission. So in Budapest, we actually had 3 people from the community who were at first allowed to go and be the members of that committee. But then the order came from Minsk that that's not going to work, and for one reason or another, 2 out of 3 were ousted out of the committee. So, and this already raised certain indignation, and people were starting to ask questions and were wondering how and what they can do. So the next stage would be to become an observer. However, on that stage already, the embassy, probably they were scolded and they were not allowed to do certain things. They declared that they already have their own observers, and those who came later would be allowed to be present only at a certain stage, which means that those would not be the people present at the counting of the votes, and the whole thing pretty much lost meaning. So in response to that, we decided, okay, let's have a look around, what else is available. And then a friend of mine invited me to do the exit poll, and I shared this idea with some of the people I met actually this summer. And they said, okay, let's do it. So, and we actually, we decided that we will do it 3 days before the main day of the election. And we didn't really have time to apply to the local government to use, the space. So the whole day of Sunday, we were sitting on a bus stop and, running after people getting out of the embassy gate to ask who they voted for.
Amazing. I mean, that's an uncovered story that I don't think anyone was writing about it in extent in our journal. But there are many things that we don't talk a lot about, although it received some attention in the press, and one is how important the women's movement was in the whole Belarusian popular movement. So every Saturday there was a women's march, a little bit of echoes of the French Revolution there that also featured, the French Revolution also featured that kind of the march of the women for their detained relatives, or later on just the march of the women. And we can see parallels with what is happening right now in Poland, that is on the other side. It's in the EU, but because of the abortion laws, there is a big women-led protest movement, political protest movement that is not only against the abortion law, but basically the whole regime. So can you tell me about how this happened, and why do you think that Belarusian women played such an important part in the whole, the women's movement played such an important part in this whole popular movement? And I would first turn to Almira to this, because you were writing in Al Jazeera and in many other places about this topic as well already.
Yes, that's right. And I can't stop writing about it because for me, as a feminist scholar, it has been one of the most interesting and exciting and promising, let's say, moments of Belarusian revolution. And you probably also heard that for Belarusians inside the country or abroad, Belarusian revolution already became a kind of nicknamed as a Yevolution. And it all started with the arrested image of Yeva, one of the portraits made by Chaim Sutin. And it started in June when Babarika was arrested. So Yeva then generated the whole series of actions of solidarity of women and actually the movements of solidarity of Belarusians through different countries. They started long before the elections, and then of course, the crucial moment in this mobilization of women came when Svetlana Tikhanovskaya got registered and when the three election teams of Tsepkalo and of Babarika, when they got united. I still remember very well that image and that really absolutely fantastic news that we all learned on 16th of July when Kolesnikova, Tsepkalo and Tikhanovskaya announced that they've got united. For me, that was a real beginning of the women's, let's say, history in the new Belarus. So, as a feminist scholar, I would like to say that it's indeed there are many women who are involved and who have been involved, but at the same time, let us not forget that this is the new generation of women, those who do not watch state TV, who do not support Lukashenko. For them, it's not only the violence, brutality, and abusive behavior of Lukashenko and people who are surrounding him. It's not acceptable. But this is the generation that represent completely different culture. But still, if we look back to the development and I mean to the consolidation, to the cementing of this dictatorship, it's clear that women have been till very recently one of the major social pillars of this model of authoritarianism. And when Lukashenko repeatedly said, and till recently, and actually he even now continued to say that without women he would never get to power, he was right. And it was not because he's such a handsome man, let's say, that women were particularly fascinated, but just because women in Belarus form the majority of state employees, and it's schools and factories and no, actually, in factories there is a different demographic distribution. But so women were the social pillar, and these are state employees as well as retired women, and so that's why probably it looks so unbelievable that during the events of this election campaign, women actually came to the forefront, and they made their political claims, let's say, because never before in the previous years, except very rare with very rare exceptions, women did not make any political statements and were not really seen, and others did not see them as important actors. And I do hope very much that after we win, and when the building of new institutions of power will start, that women's participation will not disappear, and they will remain active in this political and economic process. I also think that the properly feminist agenda with the gender equality and gender mainstreaming in different domains of social and economic life, this also should be part of the future transformation processes.
Same question to you as well, Olga. Your expertise is a little bit in gender studies. So do you agree with these statements made that women as how important women actually. This is a very important, very interesting aspect for me. How important these women, mostly in state jobs, keeping the society, keeping the country together, were for the Lukashenko legitimacy in all the days, and how this changed now, basically.
Well, I have a couple of points to make about this whole issue around women's participation. First of all, it's about women's political agency. I think I would claim that even though women were present in the Lukashenko's regime, their presence was tokenistic. So you can't really speak of any real political agency under the regime. Also, I think that the reason why women became so prominent in the resistance also has to do something with the nature of the regime, which for 26 years was very brutal on men. So for men to participate in any kind of open resistance right now is much more dangerous than it is for women. So women are going sort of, under the radar. And it's not characteristic only of Belarus. So if you, for example, look at the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, and there was an exhibition recently in the X Square about women's participation in the 56th revolution, you will see that even though the number of men and women who were in that revolution was equal, women made much fewer victims of the repression. So I think at the beginning, when women's participation started, they were allowed to get out to the streets and to be there just because they were not really considered a substantial political force. So that's why, if you remember, if you go back and look at the events when, these women in white who were standing on the streets of Minsk, that was like kind of the beginning of, some kind of milder period in the whole history of protests when the repression wasn't so brutal. But then, of course, you can say that we sort of gained the political recognition because, women now perhaps make the same number of among the prisoners as men. So slowly the regime came to recognize that women can be a substantial political force. Also, it's interesting to see how, when it comes to protests and solidarity abroad, how it's easier to attract women's solidarity than men's solidarity. So if you look at what was going on in Budapest on the media, I think that in Hungarian media, the Hungarian media who first tried to reach out and to really talk to people in Belarus were surprisingly women's magazines. So Elle magazine, who interviewed Yulia, who's not here today. Then there was another magazine who made an interview with another woman from a feminist movement from Minsk. And also when we were organizing our protests, the only people we were able to attract were Anna Donat from Momentum, feminist organizations, lesbian organizations, and Hungarian women journalists. So somehow, this whole thing works. So women are there, and women are expressing solidarity in here.
And it's very interesting. Exactly the parallels with the 1956 uprising, in which, the ethnic diversity kind of sometimes are made as a point around the participants of the uprising against the Soviet troops. But, the gender balance, the men versus women, even half and half point, it has never made. It's not made in schools in Hungary. It's not, some women participants are kind of underlined, but not much. And I think it's the same. So what you described is like, first they weren't reckoned with as a political force, but then it became the equality in front of the police baton. So like the violence started to kind of touch men and women equally in the end, and we could see like horrible footages of almost like allegories of this obscenely masculine regime kind of beating everyone and putting them all on trucks. But I wonder what if Almira would like to come back on any of the points made here, or I just want to make sure that if you want to respond on that.
Yes, I absolutely agree with what Olga has said. And for me also, it's a crucial issue about the recognizing or not recognizing women's agency. But actually, what happened and what also probably makes the involvement of women so peculiar is that for women and for feminist or pro-feminist women in particular, the attitude of Lukashenko to women is absolutely inappropriate. And there have been many situations when women compared his speeches with the speeches of abuser, and the entire situation when the country became the victim or the hostage of this homosocial system is compared often with the situation of domestic violence. And not only feminists speak about it, but many women, let's say, who themselves know very well what domestic violence means. And it is not by accident that the law on domestic violence was not adopted. It was actually refused by Lukashenko. He publicly told about it. So now the question of women's agency, it's also the metaphor or the way of speaking about Belarus in a broader sense. Because when we read or when we read news or when we watch the different talk shows and experts here and there, I mean, not only in Belarus but also in Russia or in other countries, when they try to identify who is orchestrating the protest and who is the main actor on the political scene, Belarusians in general are declined or are denied to be the active agents of this process. But for Belarusians, for us, I mean, inside the context, inside the situation, it's not Russia, no United States, not European Union, but Belarusians themselves should decide as agents of social change and of political revolution, should decide what will be going next. So it's again, it's a question of agency.
Indeed, yeah, you can come back on some of those points.
There were two more points that I wanted to mention and forgot. I think that it's also worth paying attention to the fact that there is a very specific form of political repression against women, which is going after their children. And Belarus is a country which has a very special law which allows some like social services to come to your house to examine if you're a worthy parent, and if you're not a worthy parent, then your children are taken away. And recently this law has been repeatedly used to prosecute women for political participation. So if you're participating in a protest, then you can risk your child being taken away into the state custody. That's one thing I wanted to mention. And another thing about, going back to what Almira said about, plans for the future and gender equality and gender mainstreaming, I think I'm quite pessimistic here because just to bring one example, there was an International Congress of Belarusians Living Abroad organized by the diaspora. And the program was made in such a way that there was one session on women's participation, but they couldn't find a person to speak in there because Yulia was in prison. She was supposed to talk there. And the person who was actually talking there was a coach, and she was saying that, women are needed in politics because they have some special female virtues which should be valued in politics, blah, blah, blah. And then at some point, there was also a session with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and that was a session with children, about children. And while the issue of children is no doubt important, to me this was really shocking because, she wasn't participating in sessions on politics, on economics, on anything actually, but on children. So, and to me it was like, she's like a person who is elected as a leader and who has evolved quite substantially over the past couple of months to become a leader, and yet you again put her into a session which would be seen as a, like a traditional women's role. And when I voiced this criticism, in the company which was organizing this this Congress, the men, of course, were denying and, saying that no, that's not something that's happening. And it turned out that actually other women who were participating in the organizing the Congress or who were watching the Congress felt the same. They did feel that, even though we are talking about the future plans, about, what we are going to do after, we are somehow being, even though we are on the forefront of the protest, we're being squeezed out of the plans for the future.
So that's not a very promising, at least from the Belarusian abroad context. Any additional responses to it? Because I think we have some leeway or time here to do this.
I'd like to add a few words to what Olya said. I have been also watching on this Congress online, and like Olga, I also was struck by a completely patriarchal, let's say, approach of organizers to the organization of the panels and to the underrepresentation, let's say, of women in different panels, be it the questions of economy or the political transformations, etc. And I also really was appalled by inviting Tsepkalo and Tikhanovskaya to speak about children and about families. But then I also noticed something in this Belarusian Congress, which was organized by the Belarusian diaspora. It was not organized by people from inside the Belarus. That actually there is now a huge, a growing gap between the political experience of Belarusian women living in Belarus and the Belarusians who live abroad. I don't know, it might be something really personal, something which might not be noticeable for many people who were participating and involved in the organization of this Congress, but I really found some of the, jokes or introductions as a kind of completely opposing to the self-perception and to the acquired political experience of women in Belarus itself. And I still think I understand Olga's, and I share Olga's concerns, but I do think that for Belarusian women, the things have changed. So it's we still have a lot of work, of course, for promoting and developing the feminist issues, let's say. It's not an easy way, it's not an easy task, but it would be just really the worst scenario if women will be again kind of pushed to the second line when the power regime will change.
Certainly looks to me as one of the most important issues of the whole political struggle. And this kind of leads to my next round of questions, which is still kind of remains here. But why do you think this all happened in 2020? Because we had like this kind of presidential elections, this kind of opposition candidates, although of course male opposition candidates being forced out of the country after an election. There were election fraud charges, of course, very founded before that, for example, in 2010. So, but we had the COVID situation in 2020. Many journalists think it was very important, but why this happened in August 2020 and not before in Belarus? And I will come back to you, Olga.
Well, I think you can answer this question on kind of two levels. One of them would be if you turn to any political scientist, and I'm not one, they would explain to you that autocratic regime over time they tend to lose connection with the society, and so basically we are at a very late stage of this autocratic society when basically the state reacts to a very imagined reality and by this kind of ruins it for itself. Also, it would be very wrong to imagine that, these protests that erupted in August are something very new for Belarus. This is something a result of quite a long history. Many people were impacted, and not just by participating, let's say, in the events in 2010, but also, for example, right now I'm reading a book which received the Gedroids Prize, the literary prize, and it's a book about the customers case. So it basically shows you that the system was dysfunctional all along. The judiciary, all sorts of systems were based on lies and repression. Also, of course, when it comes to this year, the epidemics of coronavirus played its role. It played its role not only in Belarus, it all over, because what it showed, it's kind of brought to the forefront the already existing inequalities or the existing problems, and of course it was the same in Belarus. And I think that, you know, people who were living in the country over those 26 years, they kind of gradually got used to the idea that you can't rely on the state, because the state will not provide you support, the state will lie to you. And over the year, there were this, slowly people were building solidarity between themselves. It was very much present around this COVID situation when people were trying to buy protective equipment for the doctors, to help doctors, to somehow, you know, like face the disease in a more responsive way than the state. And of course, when it came to the elections, people were already feeling that they are responsible, that they can be responsible, and they actually don't need the state so much to be present there. And I think all of this taken together is something that, you know, led to what we have right now.
What's important here is that, of course, in the spring and in the summer, the Belarusian state kind of ignored the whole pandemic. So there was like, no big deal, and you know, it will pass, it's just a flu or something. That was probably the official response from Alexander Lukashenko. How do you think, what was different here now? And I've asked that from Almira Usmanova now. What was different in 2020 that made this popular movement possible? Because there were many attempts before, of course.
Well, yes, it's obvious that there was a whole series of developments and of factors that made 2020 possible, or made it such a difficult, such a different, let's say, country. Indeed, the pandemic was probably a kind of not trigger is not the right word, but pandemic and the entire situation around COVID in Belarus have played a very important role. But I would look at it from a different point. It's not only that the state and Lukashenko himself ignored for so long, and that the doctors and the entire healthcare system was left on its own. I would look at it also from the change of social structure and of various side effects, because during pandemic, I mean, starting from March, many people either had to remain in the country, those who used to work as labor migrants in other countries, or the students also came back. And so actually many people who for many years were not present in the country because they already either emigrated or used to live and work in other countries, they got back. Probably it is not such a crucial number of people, but those are active people with completely different worldview and with a different life experience. Second very important factor, it's the change of social structure. We have already talked earlier, and it was mentioned that the new generation of Belarusians grew up, and definitely Lukashenko and the entire archaic system of governance that was built in this system is absolutely anachronistic for them. And also this is a generation which builds different professional careers and work with new technologies. And a part of the factor of generation and migration are these probably a third important issue, and that's the development of IT industry. We all understand that IT industry is booming everywhere, but the creation of the IT park in Belarus made it possible that many Belarusians, but also IT specialists from other countries, they have come to the country. And if you and they earn quite well, they have families, and they invest into the economy, they pay taxes, and economically they are much more independent than than many other social groups of electorate. And if we follow now, if you look to the social structure of protesters, that was your question from the very beginning of our discussion, IT people are very, very active, and the directors of IT companies and the forms of, I mean, the directors are much more loyal to the involvement of their employees, to the different forms of activities. Plus, it's IT sector that was in either initiating or made possible the creation of such platforms as Golos and Zuber, and crowdfunding platforms for getting funds for people who became victims of the terror. So actually, IT people and the IT sector as such plays a very crucial role in changing the social patterns of behavior and changing the economy. So that's some. And then, of course, if we speak about 2020, it's one shouldn't forget that Lukashenko himself indeed lost any sense touch with reality, and he made so many mistakes, just one by one, and the whole series of mistakes that made the protests unavoidable. So all these mistakes, starting from lying and proposing quite stupid scenarios against COVID, and then telling that constitution is not for women, arresting his main opponents, and so on and so forth. There are probably like 10 or 15 different wrong steps that he made during just several months.
So yeah, of course, obviously, this comes down to kind of breaking up or kind of drifting away from Moscow, trying to find ties in the West as well. But it's also interesting what you said about the IT sector. So, for example, this is something that big tech in the global economy does to minimize spending, to just like minimize expenses. So like moving, all these IT development or information technology outlets out into the kind of periphery to our country, but to a much larger extent to Poland and also Belarus, because, of course, from their point of view, like rent is cheaper, salary is cheaper, and this kind of, but at that society, how I gather from both of your words, in this society, this kind of kicked off like sea changes of how the society works, or how the society gets its information, its news within a country. I don't know if that's true, or are there any remarks on kind of that statement?
I think I would.
From you, for example, or whoever would like to answer. So, is this development kind of the effect of big tech on the whole thing? Do you think it's really crucial in that? And because also it's. Yeah.
Could you please elaborate a little bit on? I didn't quite get the question.
You're basically saying with the role of the IT sector that what was different now at this time in 2020 in Belarus was like globalization, economic globalization, kind of started societal developments or kind of made this IT sector appear that was much more independent and this kind. So I don't know if it's just a remark. Let's just say it's a remark. But what would be more important is like the question obviously comes that what would be, the logical conclusion to all this? Because I can see like many scenarios to this popular movement. what could they do, what's the next step. They called for different deadlines for Lukashenko's resignation, but the regime doesn't seem to falter. The internal police is in its place, the secret police is in its place, and actually it holds up a very punitive, repressive regime in response to the popular movement. So what do you think could happen? What do you see as the outcome of what is happening in Belarus still?
I'm not really, so I can't really, okay. I would say I see two possible scenarios. One is a very pessimistic one, and another is a more optimistic one. The pessimistic one would be that we will turn into some kind of junta or military dictatorship, taking into account the sick personality of Lukashenko. And, like you probably already know that in Belarus by now, these police forces, the security forces outnumber the army, and that the ratio per person is higher than anywhere in the world. So if we continue going in that direction, and there is still impunity for people who committed crimes against people, for power abuse, we might actually turn into a military dictatorship. But the good news about that one is that it doesn't really last long, so eventually it will collapse. And the more positive scenario is that resistance will go on. There will be new and more creative forms of resistance, and eventually the regime will succumb, it will collapse.
Yeah, your turn.
I also think that now everyone, of course, considers different scenarios, and I hear more pessimistic scenarios than optimistic. And actually, it's interesting that among my acquaintances, women are predominantly optimistic, let's say, about the development of events than men. And it's true. I mean, it's historical experience says that such a form of regime cannot exist long. It existed already for too long, but it started to collapse, and it continues to collapse. And this, when the president is not recognized by the majority of international of countries and by international institutions, and when the economy is degrading, here also again IT sector is important to mention. And I come back to your remark, because for almost 15 years that IT park was existing in Belarus, it became almost a country within the country. And the very first target for Lukashenko regime during last 3 months, and the target of his, let's say, aggression and of his revenge, it became the IT sector, not only because it was the park which was organized and directed for many years by Valery Tsepkalo, but also because IT sector became indeed a very important actor in the economic life, and as we see now, also in political. And so what started to happen during last months is that many of the residents of IT parks started to relocate. For the owners of IT business, the situation in Belarus is not good at all, and they found already the ways how to relocate their personnel to Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine. And it's a pity. It's just really very, very sad that it started. But I do hope that when the regime collapses, many of these people will come back, because they have families and houses and in general better conditions for work in Belarus. And so what is happening now is that not only the regime already has turned into junta, but also the economic sector gets becomes very archaicized, if I may say so. So it's just really loses its major achievements and potentials, because when we see that IT sector is under attack. Then we also see what has happened to culture and education, and the regime is killing itself. So probably Belarusians do not have to sit and wait until it will collapse by itself. But in fact, my optimism is based precisely on this perception of the regime as a suicidal regime that actually continues to sink.
Yeah.
Police and the military forces, it's a huge problem. It's that what Olga said bothers me a lot as well, because these people are used to live and to action in this way, and the ratio per person is enormous. And I'm even afraid of think what will happen when they will remain in the country after the regime will collapse.
So it's still very much up in the air, if I understood you well. Well, it seems like I think the short film is really educational in the sense that it not only shows the kind of the faceless but still solid nature of power impersonating it in that prison. It also shows the very important role of the women who gather there, mostly women and elderly men as well, but the women are mostly who are kind of contributing to that discussion that was unfolding in front of the prison itself. But it just shows another thing that it came to mind, and I kind of concluded it from our discussion, that it's a very slow process to deal with a regime like that. And it's kind of a very, very tiresome work of chipping away at a big tree until it kind of collapses in the end. And that would be sort of a source of optimism at this point, I would say. And with that, I would like to thank my guests who are participating to this discussion, Olga Zubkovskaya from Budapest and Almira Usmanova from Vilnius. Of course, the events of Belarus will continue like that for a longer and extended time, and we will do, even though we don't do live blogs like in the beginning of months, probably events can kind of unfold in a more dramatic way, then we will get back to it. So, you know, everyone will be following that news as best as we can. And you can, guests of Versio Festival can watch Walls, a production of Belsat, for free as well on your website. And it's also important to tell that we were discussing a lot about the Belarusian opposition as well. On October the 22nd, they were the recipients of the Sakharov Prize from the European Union for their bravery and resistance. And I think it's quite... it's as well, it shouldn't be understood as a prize for any kind of opposition politicians within the country and exile, but also to the self-organizing people, to the horizontal organizing committees, to the women's movement, to the, you know, disabled people who are kind of fighting for their lives and for justice in the country. So thank you for watching this roundtable this evening. I think it was, at least for me, but I hope also for the guests, it was a very exciting discussion with a lot of conclusions and repercussions also for the EU and also for Hungary. I think that we didn't have time to deal with here. But again, Walls is an actually a really good short movie in its kind, and I would recommend everyone to watch it. And have a nice day. Don't forget that in Budapest there is a curfew now from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. So, you know, take care of yourself, not only here in the Hungarian capital, but everywhere else. And good night.